Once again, the Queen of Consorts surprises us, but not in a good way.
Made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia.
Britain had witnessed royal weddings, public scandals, family departures, and the loss of a beloved monarch, but nothing could have prepared the country for the announcement King Charles was about to make. With Camilla only a few rooms away and senior royals gathered in silence, the king revealed a decision that sent shockwaves through the palace. Camilla would no longer continue in her role as queen, and her future within the monarchy had been dramatically changed. Charles knew the seriousness of what he was doing. William sat beside Catherine while Princess Anne and Prince Edward looked over sealed documents bearing Camilla's name. Phones had been surrendered outside, guards stood watch beyond locked doors, and what had been described as a constitutional briefing quickly became something much more personal. The king lifted the declaration with shaking hands. He announced that Camilla would no longer carry out the duties linked to being queen, would step away from her position as the monarchy's leading female figure, and would live in a far more private role for the remainder of his reign. William watched his father struggle through every word. The future king had seen Charles endure difficult moments before, but this was different. Catherine exchanged a glance with William, realizing the decision would affect their own responsibilities as much as it affected Camilla. Anne remained composed, though she noticed another page hidden beneath her brother's hand. The extra document suggested there was more to the story than anyone had yet been told. Camilla stayed motionless when the news arrived in her private rooms. Holding tightly to the arm of her chair, she asked a single question. Had Charles personally approved every word? The answer came back quietly. He had. She stared at the notice, searching for any sign that the decision could be reversed. There was none. No review period, no temporary arrangement, and no path back to her former position. Calmly, she placed the document down and headed toward the king's private rooms. William noticed immediately and understood what was about to happen. Charles had acted as king, but Camilla was coming to face him as a wife. While the public focused on what Camilla had lost, those inside the palace were already asking a different question. What would the rest of the family gain, sacrifice, or reveal because of it? Behind the titles stood a family tied together by duty, marriage, and years of unresolved tensions. Charles had made his announcement, but he could not avoid facing the woman whose future he had just changed. Camilla had endured years of criticism before finally reaching the throne. Now she felt pushed away from it by the very man who had once defended her. William stood uncomfortably between both sides. He knew that one wrong conversation could turn a royal dispute into a lasting family conflict. After the meeting, Charles remained alone. Removing his glasses, he stared at the declaration before him. The crown demanded stability, but stability often came at a cost. For decades, he had defended Camilla through controversy and public criticism. Now, he had become the person responsible for taking away the role she had fought so hard to achieve. Becoming queen had symbolized acceptance after years of struggle. Losing that position felt far more personal than simply stepping back from duties. To Camilla, it felt like rejection. She refused assistance from staff and sat quietly with the folders beside her. She told her aide she would speak only with Charles. Throughout years of pressure and scrutiny, she had trusted him to stand beside her. Now she struggled to understand why that support seemed to have vanished. Outside her room, William paused at the door. Their history had never been simple, but hearing emotion in her voice left him torn between old resentment and genuine sympathy. In the end, he lowered his hand and walked away. Charles was struggling behind one door. Camilla was waiting behind another, and William felt powerless to help either without hurting the other. Meanwhile, Catherine received a revised royal schedule. Several ceremonial duties previously assigned to Camilla would now be transferred to her. She immediately understood the problem. Every public appearance could make it seem as though she had benefited from another woman's downfall. She quietly told William she wanted no celebration. He agreed. Even silence, however, might be interpreted as ambition. Later, Anne pulled her nephew aside and warned him that the crisis had not started with a single disagreement. During a private royal ceremony, Camilla had crossed a line Charles had specifically asked everyone to respect. According to Anne, a written account existed explaining why Charles felt he could no longer defend the situation. If the family wanted answers, they would have to look back at the ceremony where tensions finally reached a breaking point. The collapse had not begun with an argument. It began with a chair, a sealed instruction, and a ceremony that attracted little attention at the time. Only a small group of royals attended when Camilla made the choice that changed everything. Charles had issued a direct instruction concerning the future direction of the monarchy. Camilla understood it. William understood it. Yet when the crucial moment arrived, events unfolded in a way that forced Charles to confront concerns he had been trying to manage for years. The tension had been building long before Windsor Castle. Camilla had supported keeping trusted allies in key ceremonial positions and royal patronages. Charles, meanwhile, worried that overlapping influence within different royal households was creating confusion just as William and Catherine moved closer to their future roles. The king wanted a clear structure for the monarchy moving forward. Camilla feared that such changes would gradually reduce her place within it. That fear became visible during a private investiture planning event at Windsor Castle. Charles had left a sealed written instruction reserving the central chair for Catherine, a decision meant to reflect the monarchy's future direction. What happened next would become the moment many inside the palace later pointed to as the beginning of a much larger crisis. But Camilla took the seat before the meeting even began and refused an aide's request to move. Catherine paused in the doorway and said nothing. Camilla remained seated with her hands firmly on the chair, making her point without raising her voice. When William arrived and saw Catherine standing aside, anger immediately surfaced. He believed the move was meant to undermine his wife's future role, but Catherine's calm reaction stopped him from turning the moment into a larger conflict. After the ceremony, Charles confronted Camilla privately. He asked why she had ignored his direct instruction. According to palace records, Camilla replied that she would not allow herself to become invisible, simply because the next generation was moving closer to the throne. To Charles, those words carried a deeper meaning. What he heard was not just defiance, but a sign that his marriage and the future succession of the monarchy were beginning to pull in different directions. His concerns grew when Anne presented documents showing previous instructions that had allegedly been altered, delayed, or reinterpreted by people connected to Camilla's household. Replaced seating cards suggested the challenge had been planned before anyone even entered the room. Soon after, Charles summoned Camilla to his private study without advisors present. The chair at Windsor had exposed the tension, but inside that locked room, away from staff and cameras, the real confrontation finally began. Charles remained calm when Camilla entered, which somehow made the moment feel even more serious. The altered seating plan sat on the desk between them. Camilla expected anger, but instead she saw disappointment and sadness. Then Charles asked the question that cut through years of shared history. Had she ever truly intended to support the future he was trying to build? Charles wanted a clear answer. Was Windsor simply a misunderstanding, a moment of frustration, or part of a wider effort to preserve influence? For years he had defended Camilla through criticism and controversy. She entered the room believing that history still protected her. Charles entered knowing that personal feelings could no longer settle what duty demanded. He slid the seating plan across the desk and asked whether she had approved Catherine's removal from the central position. Camilla admitted she knew the seat had been intended for Catherine. However, she argued that surrendering every visible sign of seniority would leave her queen in title only. She had spent years fighting for acceptance and felt her place within the monarchy slowly slipping away. Charles listened before delivering words she never expected to hear. "The throne," he said, "was never created to prove our love." He made it clear that his affection for her remained, but as king, he could not allow personal loyalty to outweigh the future needs of the monarchy. The words hit hard. Camilla removed a royal brooch and placed it beside the documents. To her, it represented far more than jewelry. It symbolized rank, recognition, and belonging. She told Charles he could not ask her to display symbols of authority while steadily reducing her influence. Charles then opened Anne's file, which contained records showing communication between members of Camilla's office and ceremonial planners regarding the Windsor arrangements. Camilla accused William's household of building a case against her, but Charles immediately stopped her. William had not made the final recommendation. He had. That admission changed everything. Camilla stood up, left the brooch where it sat, and walked out without asking for sympathy or looking back. Charles remained alone until her footsteps faded. Only then did he press the private bell and summon the constitutional secretary. When the secretary entered, Charles ordered a formal declaration reducing Camilla's public role. Their marriage had survived years of controversy, public criticism, and pressure. But once Charles transformed the disagreement into an official royal instruction, The conflict moved beyond emotions and into authority. What had started as a private dispute was now becoming a constitutional decision. Behind the king's declaration stood several family members who had reached similar conclusions for different reasons. William wanted stability. Anne wanted accountability. Catherine wanted protection from a conflict she had never sought, yet everyone understood that reducing Camilla's role would affect the entire family. As they gathered around the long table, the constitutional secretary explained that while Camilla's marriage to the king remained unchanged, her public duties, ceremonial role, household authority, and access to certain royal privileges could all be restructured. Catherine reviewed the proposed schedule and immediately recognized the danger. Her name appeared beside ceremonies Camilla had previously expected to lead. Every new responsibility risked creating the impression that she had benefited from another woman's downfall. William quickly insisted that Catherine must never appear to have requested any of the transfers. He feared public sympathy for Camilla could easily become criticism aimed at his wife. Catherine agreed, but each reassigned duty made the situation feel increasingly personal. Anne then addressed Charles directly. She argued that protecting Camilla from consequences would weaken the monarchy and damage his credibility. Rules, she reminded him, only matter when they apply equally to everyone, especially those closest to the sovereign. Charles listened carefully, while Edward remained mostly silent, fully aware that additional duties would also fall to him. His silence alone showed that support for the decision extended beyond a single voice. The advisors then revealed the most significant change. Future household appointments and public engagements connected to Camilla would require approval through the king's office. Charles signed another instruction making the decision difficult to reverse under future pressure or changing circumstances. As he placed the pen down, he looked toward William and offered a warning. "A future monarch," he said, "must never confuse personal affection with constitutional responsibility." Only minutes later, Camilla's senior aide received orders to begin clearing part of her office before sunset. The signatures themselves made no sound, but their consequences echoed throughout the palace. By the time instructions reached Camilla's household, her world was already beginning to change. The first sign was not a headline or public announcement, it was an empty calendar. Engagements disappeared, briefing folders stopped arriving, and staff members who once visited daily were quietly reassigned elsewhere. Then came the instruction to clear the office from which she had exercised influence for years. For a woman who had spent decades fighting to stand beside the king, the growing silence inside the palace felt harsher than any public criticism. The palace itself looked unchanged, but around Camilla, everything was beginning to disappear. Camilla stepped into her office and immediately froze. Archive boxes lined the room beside her desk, waiting to carry away a life she had never agreed to leave behind. An aide quietly explained that the office had to be cleared before evening. Camilla refused to touch a single item. Packing her belongings herself would feel like accepting Charles's decision, and she was not prepared to do that. Her official calendar had already been emptied, events reassigned and appearances canceled. Even statements from her communications team now had to pass through the central palace office. For years, her household had operated with its own authority. Now, even her words required approval. The silence became harder to bear as staff began removing photographs from shelves and desks. Camilla watched without speaking until one aide reached a private picture of Charles. She immediately crossed the room, took the photograph herself, and held it tightly against her chest. The image reminded her of everything they had survived together. Charles had stood beside her when public criticism was at its worst. Yet now it was his own order dismantling the world they had built over decades. The next blow arrived in a folder containing updated schedules and correspondence. Several charities had already been informed that Catherine, Anne, or Sophie could represent the crown at future engagements. Every replacement made the message impossible to ignore. This was not a temporary adjustment. Plans were already being made for a future without Camilla at the center of royal life. As she turned another page, she discovered that even the next major state ceremony had been altered. She would no longer enter beside Charles. What had started as a private decision was now becoming visible to the entire nation. Her disappointment slowly turned into determination. Then something unexpected happened. Charles passed the office while staff continued packing. Camilla noticed his shadow beneath the doorway and realized he had stopped. For a brief moment, she expected him to enter. The handle never moved. He continued walking. Later that night, no advisor arrived and no official message followed. Instead, a handwritten note appeared. Charles asked her to meet him in the small garden room at dawn. By sunset, the structures that had defined Camilla's public role were disappearing one by one. But dawn would bring something very different. There would be no advisors, no documents, and no palace staff standing between them. For the first time since the announcement, they would face each other simply as husband and wife. Charles arrived first. Camilla entered a few minutes later, carrying the photograph she had rescued from her office. The atmosphere felt completely different from every meeting that had come before. There were no titles to hide behind and no official duties to discuss. For a moment, they were simply two people trying to understand whether a relationship that had survived decades of pressure could survive this crisis as well. Charles had requested the meeting because he understood something important. His decision had settled Camilla's public position, but it had also shaken the foundation of their marriage. Royal authority could determine roles, responsibilities, and public status. It could not answer whether trust still existed between them. Camilla had not come seeking a reversal. She needed to know whether he still believed in her. Carefully placing the photograph on the table, she asked the question that had haunted her since the announcement. Had he acted because she had embarrassed the monarchy, or because he no longer trusted her? Charles answered without hiding behind royal language or procedure. He told her that he still loved her deeply. But love alone could not justify actions that placed personal relationships above the future stability of the monarchy. He explained that Catherine's growing role was never meant as a personal attack. It reflected the reality of the future the institution was preparing for. Camilla listened quietly before finally admitting what had truly driven her actions. It was fear. She had spent years facing criticism, rejection, and public judgment before finally earning acceptance. Somewhere along the way, she became convinced that Catherine's rise would erase everything she had fought so hard to achieve. The fear of becoming irrelevant had pushed her further than she realized. Then she made a choice Charles never expected. Camilla said she would stop challenging Catherine's future position. She would no longer compete for ceremonial influence or attempt to hold on to authority that was naturally shifting toward the next generation. She asked for no secret guarantees, no promises, and no pathway back to her former role. Charles responded with equal honesty. She would remain his wife. She would keep a protected private residence, continue to receive respect, and remain an important part of his personal life. But her public role as queen would not return. Slowly, Camilla removed the brooch she had carried since leaving his study. She placed it into Charles's hand and quietly told him that the crown should decide where it belonged. Neither smiled, neither celebrated, but neither walked away. In that moment, they preserved something far more valuable than status. Only hours later, palace officials finalized preparations for the public announcement. While Charles and Camilla had reached a fragile understanding, the rest of the country was about to deliver its own judgment. Millions would soon decide whether the king had protected the monarchy or sacrificed the woman beside him to save it. By breakfast, the story dominated Britain. Television broadcasts interrupted regular programming. Radio stations led with updates. Newspapers rushed out special editions. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Some praised Charles for putting duty first. Others believed he had treated his wife unfairly in order to protect the institution. One image captured the national mood more clearly than any headline. Outside Buckingham Palace, hundreds of people gathered in silence beneath gray skies. No chants, no celebrations, just quiet reflection as the royal household entered a new chapter. Charles watched the early coverage alone. Broadcasters explained that Camilla remained his wife, but would no longer perform major ceremonial duties associated with the role of queen. Commentators quickly divided into opposing camps. Some argued the decision demonstrated accountability within the monarchy. Others believed it revealed deep family tensions that should never have reached public view. When one television presenter described Camilla as the greatest personal sacrifice of Charles's reign, he quietly switched the television off. Across Britain, debate intensified. One major newspaper printed the image of an empty ceremonial chair beneath the headline, "The Queen Who Stepped Away." The symbolism spread rapidly. For supporters, the chair represented loss. For critics, it represented accountability. Either way, it became the defining image of the story. Outside the palace gates, ordinary people offered their own perspectives. One woman placed flowers beside the fence and quietly remarked that no crown was worth losing a family. Another questioned whether duty should ever come before personal loyalty. Their comments quickly spread through television reports and online discussions, adding even more pressure to an already emotional situation. Camilla heard the reactions but refused every request for an interview or statement. She honored the promise she had made during her conversation with Charles. Remaining silent was difficult. Every day, strangers debated her motives, her legacy, and her future. Yet speaking out risked turning a private compromise into a public conflict. Meanwhile, Catherine faced challenges of her own. Her first reassigned engagement was announced only days later. She would represent the crown at a national charity service that had originally been expected to include Camilla. The transfer confirmed that changes were already taking effect. William responded immediately. He instructed his staff not to celebrate, not to brief reporters, and not to treat the situation as any kind of victory. He understood how easily public perception could shift. Catherine's growing role could never appear to be built upon another woman's loss. As preparations began for the family's first public appearance under the new arrangement, tension spread throughout the palace. Every movement would be analyzed. Every photograph would be studied. Every position in the procession would carry meaning. When the day finally arrived, the nation watched closely. Charles appeared first, carrying the weight of the decision on his shoulders. William and Catherine followed, representing the future of the monarchy. Anne stood nearby, continuing her familiar role as a symbol of duty and stability. One figure, however, was missing from the ceremonial center. Camilla remained absent from the position she had once occupied. Before leaving his private rooms, Charles reportedly paused for a moment. The empty space beside him reflected everything that had changed. Yet he refused to delay the service. Steadying himself, he stepped forward alone. The symbolism was impossible to miss. Catherine walked farther down the procession as the principal female royal, accepting responsibilities she had never actively sought. William remained beside her, fully aware that their greater role had arrived through sacrifice rather than celebration. Away from the cameras, Camilla watched privately without the ceremonial symbols that had once defined her public position. She remained composed as Catherine occupied the place she had once held. The moment hurt, but she no longer resisted it. Her life with Charles would continue, but not as part of a shared royal future. Anne remained close to Charles throughout the service. She said very little, yet her presence served as a reminder that duty often carries consequences no public approval can erase. Charles had restored clarity to the monarchy, but the cost had been deeply personal. Later, Charles returned to the private apartments where Camilla was waiting. No officials joined them. No discussions about restoring roles took place. The public battle was over. He sat beside her, and she quietly took his hand. Camilla had not disappeared from his life, nor had her history been erased. What she had lost was the future she once imagined. Charles had chosen the institution over her public position, believing the monarchy's stability demanded it. Their relationship endured, but the chapter they had shared as king and queen had come to an end. In the end, the announcement that stunned Britain was not truly about destroying a marriage. It was about separating love from power. Charles kept the crown, Camilla kept her dignity, and the monarchy moved forward forever changed by the choice that forced them apart. What do you think? Did Charles make the right decision, or did he sacrifice too much in the name of duty? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more royal stories and hidden palace drama. Thanks for watching.